Hello from Valour, Canada. We are a Calgary-based nonprofit with the goal of educating Canadians, especially youth, about our country's military history and heritage. This video is about propaganda, a very appropriate topic for our increasingly digital world. This presentation will begin with some definitions and a discussion of the purpose of propaganda. Then we will look at when an individual or a population is most susceptible to propaganda. So in other words, under what conditions is propaganda most effective? Then next we will look at 12 techniques using Canadian wartime posters and editorial cartoons as examples. And then lastly, we will wrap it up with a short conclusion.
So let's get at it. What is propaganda? Well, the word propaganda has a Latin origin, propagare, meaning to propagate, which itself means to spread through a medium, whether a substance or a group of people. Propagare was first used in the early 1600s by the Catholic Church to mean spread the faith. Now, I want you to take a moment or two to pause the video right now and read the two definitions on the screen, and then note the subtle differences between the two. Okay, so to summarize the two, a simple meaning for propaganda would be information presented that aims to manipulate the audience. Also note that the first definition on the screen has neither a positive nor a negative connotation, while the second subtly presents the idea of not being completely forthright or honest. More on this negative association will become apparent throughout this video. And just a note that the best propaganda has an abundance of truth that is simply spun in a certain direction. Now, before we get too far along, I want to discuss how propaganda is different from education or the news. So first off, let's define those two terms. And I want to be clear, for both of these, we are looking at the ideal, meaning the perfect objective model for both education and the news. And yes, we know the perfect is unattainable, but it does provide something to strive towards. Education, in an ideal sense, is supposed to provide as much information and differing arguments as is possible without bias, and then allow the audience, so the students, to decide what makes most sense or is most logically sound. The news, also in an ideal sense, is supposed to be an objective, non-biased account of events designed to inform the viewer about the facts on the ground regarding a current or developing story. So you probably noticed me mention without bias, and that's the key point here. As bias increases, the less objective the information becomes, and the likelihood that that information is propagandistic increases. And this applies to all information, whether written, drawn, or spoken. Propaganda, why use it and what's its purpose? Well, the goal basically is to influence a person or a group of people to think a certain thought and or to act in a certain way. So propaganda can be good in the sense of promoting positive behavior like preventing forest fires or practicing good teeth brushing technique. Propaganda has been used throughout human history during times of war, both to deceive the enemy and to boost the morale of one's followers. For example, quote, appear weak when you are strong and strong when you are weak, end quote. That quote is attributed to Chinese general and military strategist Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War 2,500 years ago, a book that has stood the test of time and has influenced strategic thinking for centuries. Another quote, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, end quote. What might that look like?
maybe information or propaganda warfare? And wouldn't war propaganda that saved any lives be considered good propaganda? Differing perspectives and the ideals we strive towards are important to keep in mind here. We should also keep in mind the question, do the ends justify the means? It is the process of grappling with these ideas and the balancing of these concerns that make us human. Okay, I'm going to downshift gears here for a moment. Here in this day and age, where our lives are increasingly digital, we are exposed to increasing amounts of propaganda, and our own media consumption habits will determine the degree to which we are subjected to that propaganda. Although our governments and others pump out propaganda nonstop, corporate propaganda, that is information designed to convince us to buy certain consumer items and products, that's likely what we are most subjected to in our daily lives. Okay, so that's a pretty substantial introduction on propaganda, but I think I'd be remiss if I were to avoid a quick discussion about what makes people more or less susceptible to propaganda. So before we get to some examples involving those Canadian war posters and editorial cartoons, let's talk about susceptibility. Critical thinking is the shield that protects an individual the most, and most of the points on this slide refer to a situation where the ability to think clearly and critically is challenged. For example, many of the physical errors, accidents, or mistakes that people make can be tied to a person or a group of people being fatigued. In other words, they're tired out and they're not performing at their best. The same can be said for mental processes. So, in other words, thinking. People who are tired and or stressed will tend to make more errors in both action and in thinking than those who are rested and comfortable. An example of this might be someone who is, quote, living paycheck to paycheck, end quote, who simply has very little time to think critically because they are too focused on putting food on the table. Now, within the context of war, when many families can be struggling, it's easy to see how they can become more susceptible to propaganda. And the crucial point here is that conditions favorable to propagation of ideas can be created. So I'm going to say that again. Conditions favorable to propagation of ideas can be created. And an extreme example of this is purposeful sensory overload or sensory deprivation that are used, two techniques that are used during torture. Okay. Now, stressful conditions can also arise naturally, like that first example that we talked about, where a person is living paycheck to paycheck under stressful economic conditions. And if a person doesn't have time to think, others, like propagandists, can put thoughts into their head. So now that we've discussed the importance of being rested and not under stressful conditions when it comes to the ability to think critically, there are a few other things that should quickly be mentioned. First, research shows that analytical or fact-based thinkers are less susceptible to propaganda than intuitive or feeling-based thinkers. Second, and further along those lines, people with a better grasp of numbers and who are stronger mathematically are less susceptible. And the reasoning behind that is that they are better positioned to assess any presented numbers in real time. Next, research also shows that generally speaking, people less exposed to social media are also less susceptible to propaganda and vice versa. And that makes sense because social media posts aim to get clicks and likes. And the best way to get these is to elicit a response, which is most often an appeal to emotion, which itself fits well within social media's very limited post space that does not facilitate a logical argument backed up with facts and evidence. It ultimately comes down to, do you trust the math that is presented to you, or would you rather do the math yourself?
Do you trust the person who caused you to react emotionally, or is there a chance they may be trying to manipulate you? To reference a Russian proverb, trust but verify. Trust but verify. Now, one final point on susceptibility. There's not clear evidence that having a higher degree of education makes a person less susceptible to propaganda. The argument for this is twofold. One, highly educated people are better able to rationalize their thinking. So to put it into different words, these highly educated people can easily produce reasons that aren't necessarily true, cause and effect wise, to justify an outcome. Two, many people with zero or little formal education operate on street smarts and people skills, and as a result, they have pretty highly developed, let's just say, BS detectors. All right, introduction complete. Let's get into the different techniques and Canadian war posters. Okay, first technique, plain folks / normal linking. And the Canadian First World War poster on the left says to prepare for winter by canning your perishables. Now, 100 years ago, when you were canning perishables, you were often using mason jars with rubber seals. So, canning doesn't actually mean the tin cans that all of our non-perishable food comes in nowadays. Anyhow, so plain folks, normal linking. This is where an attempt is made to connect or associate an idea or a person to normal / ordinary people. Often this is used to gain trust, and an example of this would be where a politician or a high-ranking member of society appears at a local, small-scale coffee shop and talks with people and has a few photographs taken. Now, the message in the war poster is to make sure that you and your loved ones, ordinary, normal people, are prepared for what could turn out to be a long winter. The second technique we're going to look at is called euphemism. This is where less offensive language or words are used in order to decrease the chance of a negative association being made to an idea. So we see the cartoon there. What's that about? Well, modern-day Kitchener, a city in southern Ontario, had what was deemed an unfortunate name at the beginning of the First World War. It was called Berlin, a name that aligned with the area's large population of German immigrants. Due to rising anti-German sentiment during the First World War, many other Ontarians did not want to buy anything from Berlin, Ontario. As a result, Berlin's community members voted to change the town's name. It was a very close vote. Kitchener, a last-minute addition to the list, was the winning name. And just as a bit of an aside there, so Kitchener was added in recognition of Lord Kitchener, who had died a few months earlier in the war. Now, in another curious twist to the story, the name Corona was also in the running for the votes. Thankfully, they didn't choose that one, or they probably would have had to rename the city again here over the last few years. Another example of euphemism is the transition to post-traumatic stress disorder, so PTSD, from the First World War term shell shock. Okay. Now, these terms are used to describe soldiers incapacitated by battle stress. And nowadays you hear PTSD quite often. So that's where that term originated from. And the American comedian and political commentator George Carlin outlines this progression of increasingly sterile euphemisms in a skit. And I'll put the link that shows that skit in the description of the video. The next example is called transfer or symbol linking. Okay, and on the left there you see a Canadian First World War cartoon that shows the Ypres Salient in Belgium following the Battle of Mount Sorel. Now, transfer or symbol linking This is where the propagandist tries to make an indirect or subtle association of a symbol, often an archetypal symbol, meaning good versus evil, where the propagandist attempts to make an association between a symbol and a person or an idea. Okay, and when you're looking at the cartoon, you see the beaver, which is a very Canadian thing, and you actually see what looks to be a bit of a maple leaf right here. Okay, so the association is trying to be made to being Canadian. Now, a common modern version of transfer or symbol linking is frequently used by politicians and their photographers, is to have a circular logo on the wall behind a podium where the politician is speaking, and then at the appropriate distance and angle, the photographer can position himself or herself so that the logo appears, or the circular figure appears directly behind the politician's head, and this kind of gives the politician a halo or a golden crown, which is an association to good or Jesus or sun god. In this poster, there was a battle near Ypres that was recently won by the Canadiens, and the front line was redrawn, and this cartoon shows the front line as a beaver. Now, in reality, this is what it looked like. You can see the battle line here. Okay, it doesn't really look like a beaver. It's just a bit of a bulge. And the location of Montreal is right here, number 2. Okay. Also, I want to point out that on this map here, north is to the top, and on the cartoon, north is to the left. Now, why is the cartoon propaganda? Well, we've already talked about the symbol of the beaver and trying to link it to Canadian. There's also the word celebrated here in the caption, and then we also see that this was published in the Montreal Daily Star, which is interesting. Canadian symbol, Montreal. Canadian students, why do you think that this cartoon was presented like this in the location that it was? Bandwagon is the next technique, and the message behind bandwagon propaganda is basically that if you're not part of the group, you're an outsider, and who wants to be an outsider? Or we're all in this together. It exploits the common need to fit in. I think it's also important to mention here that sock puppets and bots on social media can easily make it appear that an idea or a statement, etc., is much more popular than in reality. And when we look at the poster there on the right, that's a Canadian Second World War poster that shows a soldier at the top, an industrial worker with a rivet gun in the center, and then a farmer, the woman there on the bottom. The next technique is testimonial, and this is where someone's social credibility or influence is used to promote a certain idea or a person. Okay, now celebrities and experts are most often used for testimonials, and very frequently they're paid to provide a testimonial. And if you can combine the two, so let's say a celebrity expert, like a doctor that is frequently on TV, they have a little bit of extra oomph in this example because an expert also has authority, and authority can be a fallacy where a person might make an argument where they say this person's an expert or this person's an authority, so therefore they're right, and that isn't always necessarily true. You still have to think critically about what experts and authorities say, because they may have interests that aren't apparent in the moment. And just
further along those lines, anyone listening here that is frequent to social media, they know that on social media there are many influencers. And again, these people are paid for their testimonials as well. Sometimes they're just paid with free products. Anyhow, I want to go to the poster here. So this is a First World War poster, so it's over 100 years old, and it asks white men to give to the Canadian Patriotic Fund. And when we look closely at this image here, we notice that there are some major issues and untruths here. And I'll leave you to pick those out. But I just want to focus on the fact that the poster employs the inverse of social credibility and influence. Okay. Now, if we look at the poster, the text, it says, "Paleface, my skin is dark, but my heart is white, for I also give to the Canadian Patriotic Fund." So the Aboriginal man there on the poster is speaking to white men. So the idea here is that the aim is to shame white men into giving money to the fund. And I would bet that this poster was probably seen in only in Canadian cities where there wasn't a high population of Aboriginal, Métis, or Inuit Canadians. So again, it uses the inverse of social credibility, and to me that makes this a very manipulative poster. The next technique is fear. Some would call fear FUD, FUD being an acronym for fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And the goal with the fear technique is to use scare tactics to instill fear in order to drive behavior or promote certain ideas. So often this tactic is most effective when the audience has very limited information about a topic, and as a result, speculation can run rampant. So looking at the posters, the one on the left is a Canadian First World War poster, and the request is for women to convince men to enlist. The text includes references to personal safety, the children, and social standing. All three things very important for women. Also, I should note that alongside a propaganda campaign like this that tries to convince men to enlist, there were women in Britain, Canada, and Australia who would, when out in public, pin a white feather on a man who appeared to them to be perfectly able to enlist, but who clearly hadn't enlisted yet. The white feather was a mark of a coward. I also find it interesting that this happened in British Empire countries, but not in the US. The poster on the right is a Second World War poster, and it references children again. Quote, "Make no mistake, if the Axis should win this war, your children will be doomed to a life of slavery and moral degradation. To control their future, the enemy is bidding all the power built up through years of totalitarian scheming and preparation. But you can outbid the enemy. It's up to you." End quote. And that's from the first paragraph of that poster on the right. Here's another one that utilizes FUD. This Canadian World War I cartoon shows the Dance of Death from the Grain Grower's Guide, Winnipeg. I had to include this one because it really is a terrifying addition to a public periodical. Note the date, October 1914. So the First World War started only 2 months earlier, and Canada was not yet physically involved in the fighting. So the Canadian public has limited information and experience about the war when they see this cartoon. So it's kind of blurry, so I'm gonna go counterclockwise from the left of the drum, which I'll put my pointer on so I can point it out. So this person here is Pestilence. This person here, Cannon Maker. This person, Ruin. This person, Powder Maker. This person, I'm not really too sure, looks like the devil. Got the cloven hooves and the horns and the
shaggy wings. This gentleman here is a German soldier with a characteristic pickelhaube helmet. This person is famine. And lastly, this person, armament trust. And they're all dancing to the drum beat of war. And they're dancing on people. If you look closely, you can see people. And against a backdrop of explosions and smoke. The next technique is name calling. Many know this as ad hominem. This tactic can be employed in different ways. One way it can be employed is to promote opposition against an idea, person, organization, etc., based solely on a negative portrayal of that idea, person, organization, etc. Another way is that it can also diminish the presenter's argument or the facts presented by them solely by attacking the person or organization making the claim. Like I said, this is called ad hominem, which translates to towards the person. In other words, it's a personal attack that attempts to deflect attention from the argument or the facts at hand. Another component of this technique is that it also tries to elicit a feeling-based response rather than a response based on fact. If we look at the poster there on the right, it's a Second World War poster because we see Hitler as the devil. Okay, so we've covered 7 different techniques so far, and as we look at the next few, you'll notice that many of these use 2 or more of the techniques we've covered. The next technique is called Dehumanize or dehumanization. This technique is similar to name calling, but it's definitely a few steps up from that in terms of the response it's trying to generate. So if we look at the poster on the left, that's a Canadian First World War poster that shows a German soldier. You can see his characteristic helmet. The soldier's holding a rifle with smoke wafting from the end of the barrel, and he's overlooking what appears to be a deceased woman in the middle of the street clutching a baby to her naked breast. So the idea here is that the soldier killed this innocent, undefended woman with a baby. So dehumanization, essentially it aims to legitimize less respectful than normal treatment against those who are targeted. This is a serious human transgression. In genocide, researchers see dehumanization as one of the middle steps in the process to a genocidal event. So be aware of this when you see it. Often the argument comes in the form of that person or group of people did this unacceptable thing, so I or my group of people are within our rights to do this worse unacceptable thing to them. Okay, so back to the poster, that German soldier did this horrible, undefendable thing, so we should be able to take him out. And just to translate this poster for you, Canadiens, it's time to act. Do not wait until the Huns wreak havoc in Canada. Down here, Canadiens, man up. Do not stay behind. Enlist in our French-Canadian regiment. Okay. Now, and Canada has some examples of these types of things, although definitely not on the scale of mass killing. So, for example, in the First World War, Canada took a lot of Eastern European and German immigrants and put them in internment camps. The idea was that those Eastern European immigrants and German immigrants could be spies, or maybe they had political ideas that weren't approved of or were deemed too risky by those in power. So in order to protect all the other Canadians, these people needed to be locked up. Similarly, in the Second World War, Canada did the same thing with Japanese Canadians. Some people thought that the Japanese Canadians could be spies, and therefore they put the rest of the Canadiens at risk and they should be locked up. So it's definitely a propaganda technique you need to watch out for. So it escalates back and forth, back and forth. And, you know, if that goes on indefinitely and it's balanced, what you're looking at is a MAD situation, so mutually assured destruction. But as soon as one group gets the upper hand, this is when genocide happens.
The next technique is called loaded language. And the poster on the right there is from the Second World War, and it shows a Japanese soldier threatening the west coast of Canada and a Nazi soldier threatening the east coast. And look at the body language, right? They both have clenched hands and they're kind of reaching out at Canada, threatening it. Now, the technique loaded language, to describe it, this is where carefully selected vocabulary and or hyperbolic statements are used to better elicit an emotional response targeted by the propagandist. Loaded language is opposite to euphemism on the selected vocabulary spectrum. So what I mean by that is euphemism tries to play down the offensiveness, whereas loaded language tries to purposely use words that will elicit an emotional response. Now, I'm going to pull some examples from this poster. And before I do, I just want to point out, so this bit here is exactly what's written here. It's just I pulled it over and made it bigger so that you can see it more easily. So the first example I want to pull out is in this first sentence. It says, Canada is now menaced directly on both coasts. Okay, and we can see that in the picture. Now, granted, we have the benefit of hindsight now, but we were never attacked directly on Canadian soil. So how serious of a threat was their menacing, right? Maybe not so serious. Another quote that we can pull from this is right here. The war has spread in a twinkling across two oceans. So this to me implies that the enemy is far-reaching and can act quickly from a distance. But what is the likelihood for a surprise attack on Canadian soil? How about a large-scale surprise attack? The next one, Canada stands squarely in the path of the conflict. Well, that's another group of words that suggests that we are going to get hit on our home soil. If we are, quote, squarely in the path of conflict, end quote, what does that make Europe or other much larger players like the United States? For example, Pearl Harbor. Next one is ultimate triumph. And this suggests that ultimate triumph is right here. This suggests that if you or if we buy bonds, you or we can end the war. Now, I don't have a date for this poster, but I would guess that it's likely from early in the Second World War, probably late 1940 or 1941, once Japan had joined the war, and also when the Canadian public still had less knowledge and experience with the war. So this poster also uses the FUD technique and the bandwagon technique, because the last sentence there, we must be prepared to do our part. The next technique is called repetition. And this Canadian First World War poster shows a Canadian soldier holding what looks to be an injured or deceased nursing sister while being fired at by a German U-boat. This references the story of the sinking of Llandovery Castle in 1918, a Canadian hospital ship used during the First World War. And note the text there at the bottom of the poster, Kultur versus humanity. Okay, so this technique, repetition, involves choosing a word or a message, creating a positive or a negative association, and then presenting it over and over and over again. Now, in this example here, the focus is on Kultur, And over time and continuous repetition, the message is normalized and is much more easily perceived as truth, or at a minimum, completely acceptable despite the norms or understandings of the past. This poster and the one I'm about to show you both present Kultur in a way that suggests German culture has elements of racism, authoritarianism, militarism, and imperialism. And the poster designer or propagandist is consciously trying to build a derogatory narrative around that word and German culture specifically. Additionally, with the repetition technique, there can be a Pavlovian effect. And you may recall Pavlov is the gentleman who created the experience where there was a stimulus that elicited a response. And an example of this in our lives would be, you hear the dinner bell and your mouth starts to salivate. So some would also call this a dog whistle, okay, where the dog whistle is a stimulus, and this allows like-minded individuals that are responding to the, quote, dog whistle. These individuals line up in support of or in opposition to X, and that's the response. Okay. Now here's another example. This poster, the Harry Lauder poster, and a bit of story about who Harry Lauder is. So Harry was a famous musician who used his platform to convince many men to enlist. He also raised tons of money for Canada's Victory Loan Program. The poster here shows naked soldiers tangled in barbed wire while being fired upon by German soldiers. Harry's son, John, was one of those naked men, but decades later there has been controversy about the true reality of John's death. However, that's another story. I simply want to show you this poster and this as another example of the word Kultur used in a very negative light. And you can see that at the bottom there in big, bold orange letters, Kultur. This is Kultur. Also note that in both this poster and the one that I showed you with Llandovery Castle, there's a lot of dehumanization here. The dehumanization aims to legitimize bad treatment against your enemy. All right, we're almost there. These are the last two propaganda techniques. On the left, we have unfinished comparison. This technique uses an unidentified stand-in to make something look better or worse. Now, one example of this is when a brand compares itself positively to, quote, other leading brands, end quote. Another example would be when a politician or another person in a leadership role implies that their opponent is subpar without specifically identifying who they're trying to imply is worse. On the right, we see the last technique, card stacking. Okay, and just a reminder that this presentation only covers 12 techniques. There are many more than 12. Anyhow, card stacking. So this is a technique that uses only good or bad words to make something look better or worse, often without using any concrete data. So card stacking, as you might guess, is most frequently seen in product advertisements. We don't see this in war propaganda or posters hardly at all. And the idea is, like, just as the analogy with cards, you're trying to stack the deck so that you have a great hand. And same with card stacking. Most of the time we see positive words being used because you're trying to make your product look awesome in order to sell it. The development of propaganda techniques has grown rapidly since the end of the Second World War. It's important for us to keep in mind that propaganda is widespread, continuous, and can be used for both good and bad purposes. The myth of Sisyphus pushing a boulder up a hill for eternity is a fitting analogy for our struggle to have a reality-based perception and understanding of the world. And speaking of Sisyphus, in the image on the left there, you can see an amphora that has Sisyphus holding a boulder. This amphora is currently in the Munich Art Museum in Germany, and it has been dated to around 2,500 years ago. So at about the same time Sun Tzu was writing The Art of War in China, a craftsman in Greece was creating this amphora. Just a bit of an interesting aside. Anyhow, don't be discouraged by all the propaganda. All is not lost if we strengthen our minds. And you've made it this far, so you're clearly interested and motivated to learn more about propaganda. You might ask, well, how can I protect myself? Well, that's a much longer and larger discussion that basically boils down to the answer with critical thinking skills. And if viewers of this video would like me to create a new video that discusses current day propaganda techniques and how we can protect ourselves from them, please show your approval in the comments of the video. And I want to thank you for your time, and I hope that you've learned a lot about propaganda during this presentation.